You think that's funny? You think ruining my life is funny?
My name is Maya Henderson. I'm 28, and for the last 2 years, I have been living inside a world of my own making, the world of the meridian cycle. If you only saw the finished pages, you'd see elegant panels, meticulous line work, and dialogue that lands like a steady drumbeat. What you wouldn't see are the 5,000 hours stitched beneath, thumbnails that evolve into character sheets, environments built from perspective grids and reference folders, inking that steadies the hand even when the heart is shaking. Color passes that layer light on top of shadow on top of memory. It takes 8 to 12 hours to bring a single page to life. Multiply that by hundreds, and you begin to understand why I say work and not hobby. Graphic novels are not drawings with captions. They are architecture you read. I didn't arrive here on luck. 5 years ago, my debut, Shadowlands Rising, was the door that didn't creak open. It blew off the hinges. Starred reviews from Publishers Weekly and Library Journal. An Eisner on my shelf that still surprises me in morning light. 75,000 copies sold in year 1, which for an independent creator is closer to a miracle than a metric. That book led to foreign rights in 12 languages, panels at comic conventions where the line curves around a hallway, and the kind of licensing conversations where everyone speaks softly and smiles too much. My income now averages around $185,000 a year, peaking at $240,000 when new releases line up with licensing. The numbers matter only because they prove something my family still refuses to say out loud. This is a real career. It pays the rent, the taxes, the insurance, mine, and sometimes, as it turns out, theirs. My father, Kenneth, is 60. He believes in what he calls guaranteed success. He has believed in it through a restaurant that died of bad location and pride, a landscaping company that bled cash because he underbid, a used car venture that rotted under the hood, and a sequence of multi-level miracles that turned into shelves of unsellable inventory. Failures in our house never arrive as lessons. They arrive as weather. The market turned. We were early. People didn't get it. The language shifts the blame like a shell game. My mother, Janice, is 57 and works as an administrative coordinator at a mid-sized insurance company, bringing home about $58,000 a year. She is the stability in their household, the quiet metronome. She is also the amplification system for my father's optimism, turning his rehearsals into performances, calling relatives, collecting favors, smoothing the narrative until it shines. When I won the Eisner, she said, "That's nice, dear," and then asked me what I thought about your father's new idea. Last Saturday, the family gathered around the backyard pool like they do every summer. I brought my laptop because I planned to leave early and make my deadline on Volume 2. My editor's email, polite and final, hovered in the back of my head. The Meridian Cycle, by then, was more than a folder on a desktop. It was 800 illustrated pages across 3 books, 47 major and supporting characters, each tuned like instruments, 5 distinct cultures with visual languages that wouldn't permit shortcuts. My laptop sat on a slatted table near a folded towel and a sweating glass of water, a heart beating outside a body. my father approached, the air around him charged with performance. "I've been thinking about that franchise," he said loudly enough to lower the volume of 3 separate conversations. "I need you to reconsider. It's a guaranteed success. $139,000 is nothing to you." And that is the sentence, I think, that tells you everything. What your work is worth to them is always measured in what they can take from it. I told him what I had already told him, in a tone that was not angry, not cruel, simply factual. Food service is not passive income. Franchises have royalty fees that gnaw at the bottom line. Foot traffic projections are fiction until they aren't. And, most importantly, you have lost money on every single venture you've attempted. I will not fund another. There is no second act to this conversation. Maybe it was the witnesses, 15 relatives, plastic cups halved with ice, eyes bright with curiosity and dread. Maybe it was the word not. Maybe it was what he felt he was owed after a lifetime of recalculating the bill. I watched it cross his face like a shadow. He took 3 steps, lifted my laptop as if it were a paper plate, and let it fall into the deep end. There was the small, ugly sound of impact, then a burst of white bubbles, an expanding ring like a thin bruise on the water. "Oh, sorry," he said, and he smirked, because cruelty is never content to remain anonymous. "I accidentally dropped your laptop." "Oops." "Just an accident." My mother arrived at his shoulder the way she always arrives, quickly, smiling. "It's just an accident, Maya. These things happen. You should back your work up better." It's astonishing what ordinary words can do when they are used as detergent. Accident, not intention. These things happen, not we made this happen. Back your work up, not we broke it. 15 pairs of eyes tracked the sinking shape. No one contradicted him. No one said that the hand didn't slip, it chose. Silence is not neutrality. It is consent given in small, precise doses. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. Chlorine hung in the heat like a cheap perfume. Somewhere, meat crackled on a grill. A bee worried the rim of my cousin's lemonade. In my head, something quieter than anger began to count. $2,400, the mortgage payment I have covered for the last 18 months. $320, the car insurance premium. $215, internet and cable. About 85, streaming services, stacked like cushions on a couch. $160, the family phone plan. And then the card I have paid without their knowledge, so their balances didn't metastasize into panic. A house does not stand on love, it stands on money and mercy. For a long time, I have been the quiet load-bearing wall. I stayed 1 more hour. I said nothing. I wanted to measure who could live with the lie. Most of them could. Then I took my towel, my keys, the small remainder of my dignity, and left. On the drive home, a tremor moved through my hands, quick and sharp, like glass cooling too fast. I let it pass. At my desk, I flipped on my tower, logged into my cloud backups, and watched the Meridian cycle return to me. Character folders with version history, environment packs, palette files, locked scripts, active layouts, every iteration of the work that could not be drowned by a stunt. Protect the work. Protect your future self. That note on my monitor has been there for years. I read it again and knew exactly what kind of story I was now in. This is the part where you expect rage. What came was colder. Anyone who can laugh while destroying the work that feeds them has mistaken oxygen for entitlement. If they call their act an accident, then the only honest response is to teach them the difference between accidents and consequences. Not out of pettiness, not out of revenge for its own empty sake, but because boundaries are the only way to end an extraction that wears the mask of love. Just before midnight, I understood that the next scene wouldn't involve shouting or speeches or pleas. It would involve a single quiet action, a fingertip on a trackpad, a button pressed once and exactly on time. And when the ripples reached them, they could call it anything they liked. In my house, we would finally call it true. In the hours after the pool, I did what I always do when the world tries to make my work small. I widened the frame until the truth was fully in it. People like to think graphic novels are just pictures with speech bubbles, cute flourishes decorating a flimsy spine. But the spine has vertebrae, and each vertebra has tendons, and every tendon takes time. I sit in a chair and become a one-woman studio, writer, illustrator, character designer, environment artist, inker, colorist, letterer, layout director. I storyboard with thumbnails so crude they look like tired stick people enacting opera. Then I refine silhouettes until they suggest a life, a gait that hints at pride, a scar that explains a refusal, a cloak whose edge is frayed where the character fiddles when nervous. I build places from reference folders, bridges informed by cantilever math, markets that smell of citrus because the palate says so, temples that borrow their light from late winter afternoons. When the pencils are right, the inks must be truer, and then the colors must accept the light the inks insist upon. Lettering, done well, is breath control. Balloon placement directs the eye like a conductor's hand. Composition must be choreographed so a reader moves across a page at the speed of story, not at the speed of confusion. It takes 8 to 12 hours for one page to become itself. A single volume, 300 to 400 pages, deflects calendar time and becomes a measure of attention. 3,000 hours for a book that holds together, a life's worth of seconds braided and then hidden so that a reader will not feel the braid, only the flow. The meridian cycle is 3 volumes and, by every honest accounting, more than any one person should attempt. And yet, here I am, attempting it. The laptop that hit the water contained 2 years of iterative labor, files with version histories that weren't just backups, but trails of thought. I could recreate a final image, yes, but I could not recreate the 100 wrong turns that taught my hand the single right one. This is what non-artists never understand. The process is the knowledge. The drafts are the map of how you learned to see. If you want to understand why my hands didn't shake by the time I reached my desk, you should meet the people who have taught me to keep my hands steady. I still remember a teenage boy at a convention panel in Seattle, haircut too short for his head, clutching my book like a passport he feared would be taken. He waited in line for an hour, and when he reached me, he almost didn't speak. When he did, his voice made me a promise I had to keep for the rest of my career. I read Shadowlands Rising during lunch so I wouldn't sit by myself, he said. Your book made the table feel less empty. He left me a note folded into a square so tight it was hard to open. Inside, it said, "Thank you for not giving up on your characters." It helped me not give up on me. I pinned that note near my desk. When a page won't move, I read it. When a father calls my work drawing pictures, I read it again. Shadowlands Rising opened my life and complicated it. The starred reviews from Publishers Weekly and Library Journal weren't just gold stickers. They were streetlights turning on for a route I would walk for years. The Eisner changed which doors I could knock on and which would open without knocking. 75,000 copies in the first year for an independent debut is the kind of number that draws phone calls with very careful compliments and very dangerous clauses. Translations in 12 languages meant seeing my characters' names dressed in unfamiliar alphabets. Beautiful, humbling proof that a story can survive customs. I learned how licensing works, how a t-shirt is a contract with both fabric and law, how a film option is a promise and a mirage at once. I learned that speaking at a festival involves 40 minutes of talk and 40 hours of travel and 40 days of email to secure a hotel with a window that actually opens. I learned that income is not windfall. It is whether you build a house to survive. In a family like mine, however, creative labor is rendered invisible on contact. Janice would tell relatives, "Maya does some art projects," as if I were decoupaging mason jars between yoga classes. Kenneth's favorite needle is real job, threaded through so many sentences it might as well be monogrammed on his shirts. I've met that needle in other families, too, and seen how it can stitch an eldest daughter into her parents' debts while unpicking her pride. Cultural scripts do not need to be spoken aloud to be obeyed. The notion that physical labor is the only honest labor, that the person whose work happens at a desk is playing, that daughters should tithe their paychecks into the offering plate of their father's second chance. It is a common liturgy. It does not make it holy. The laptop going under was not just a device meeting water. It was a doctrine testing whether I would repent. But even as the ripples widened, I was translating his language into mine. He said, "Oops." I wrote intention. He said accident. I wrote act. He said back it up. I wrote I already did. When my mother instructed me to be more careful, what she meant was, be easier to use. When my relatives watched in silence, what they meant was, we prefer our comfort to your clarity. I know, that sounds harsh. But documentary truth often does. And this is that kind of story. We don't smooth the edges to make the subject prettier. We keep the edges so we remember what was sharp. I returned to my desk and retrieved my world from the cloud, not because I am clever, but because I am professional. Redundancy is humility masked as paranoia. It is also love for your future self. I checked the character Bibles, each of the 47 with their arcs tuned to symphonic intervals, flaws like counter melodies, visual motifs seated in early chapters that would blossom in late panels. I opened the culture folders, 5 distinct aesthetics not to be confused with stereotype, textiles built from research, not random patterns, architecture that carries its theology, color scripts that evoke without exoticizing. I reviewed the layouts for Volume 1, locked and sequenced, the active boards for Volume 2, the notes from my editor who is patient until she isn't. The files were there. The process survived, which meant I could think about what came next without bargaining with fear. Calm is not the absence of anger. It is anger taught to march. As I sat in that late-hour quiet, I realized I had been gathering data at the pool without looking like I was gathering anything. I had taken inventory of costs, of dependencies, of who benefited and how much and how often. People mistake stillness for surrender when it is often reconnaissance. My father had introduced his treatment of my life's work as an accident before an audience of 15. My mother had framed a destruction as a lesson about my caution. My relatives had demonstrated the limits of their courage with the kind of tact that buys short-term peace and long-term rot. If you listened closely to what they didn't say, you could hear the assumptions humming. Maya will keep paying. Maya will keep fixing. Maya will behave as if she is a river and we are a town entitled to water. There is a line in one of my scripts that I moved from a minor character to a major one because the story needed the weight. What you tolerate teaches. I had been teaching my family for years that I would tolerate anything if I could afford it. Mortgage, insurance, connectivity, convenience, all of it routed through my accounts so the house would stand and the arguments would quiet. None of that was charity. It was, if we're going to use the right words, enabling. And enabling is the most expensive lie a household can tell itself, because the bill arrives with interest and collects in dignity. I could, then, continue the pattern. I could decide that a laptop hitting the water was an ugly outburst in a long series of outbursts, and that maintaining the house was worth more than my respect. I could decide that family is a word with the power to nullify arithmetic. I could decide to be the river. Or I could choose a different genre. I write drama x documentary x vindication fiction, which means the win is not a miracle. It is a method. It is receipts. It is timelines. It is a consequence calibrated to teach the lesson people refuse to learn for free. Near midnight, with the files confirmed and the tremor gone from my hands, I opened a new document and titled it Accident Archive. It would hold the confirmations I was about to generate, the records of choices no one could pretend were slips. The cursor blinked like a metronome. I did not need to explain myself to a single soul in that house. I only needed to stop underwriting the story they preferred and start writing the one that was true. The next scene would not be loud. It would be exact. It would not involve confrontation. It would involve cancellation. And when it began, the button would not be pressed in anger or in haste, but with the same practiced care I bring to a page when I ink the line that defines a jaw, a city, a boundary. When I tell you my father believes in guaranteed success, I don't mean he's optimistic. I mean he treats optimism like collateral. The first time I learned what that costs, I was 23 and flush with the kind of money that felt like an accident until accountants explained it wasn't. Shadowlands Rising had just drenched my life in receipts and praise. Kenneth arrived at my apartment with printouts, and optimism so bright it threw glare on every deficiency. Pressure washing, he said, as if the phrase were a key phrase that would open an ordinary life into a bigger one. He had spreadsheets, logos mocked up in a free font, and a van he was halfway to purchasing. We just need $35,000 for equipment and inventory, he said, and my mother's voice came through him like an echo. Family helps family. I told him I could do it as a loan, principal plus modest interest when the business turned the corner. He agreed with the fervor of a man who had reached the last corner on the last street of the city that would save him. What happened next happened like it always did. The enthusiasm was cinematic. The research was a montage that cut out the boring parts where you actually verify demand. He underbid jobs to win them and then couldn't keep cash flow above water. He guessed wrong about seasonality because sunshine in a calendar doesn't translate to customers in a driveway. 17 months later, 18 if you count the last month, where everyone stops answering the phone, the business closed with equipment sold at a loss. The loan stopped being a loan the minute it became inconvenient to call it one. They renamed it Help. They wrapped it in phrases like family doesn't keep score, as if arithmetic were unloving. The balance due evaporated into a vapor that smelled like gratitude, but never condensed into a thank you. We'll make it right when the next thing hits, he said, because in our house the next thing was always the weather report, promising rain to a man carrying an empty pail. Before pressure washing, there had been the restaurant that lasted 18 months, because Kenneth fell in love with a location and refused to love a menu. He watched foot traffic ignore his front door and still felt certain that the street would apologize. He wouldn't add the dishes the neighborhood asked for because he believed he was teaching the neighborhood to eat correctly. Before that, there was the landscaping company, a cash flow parable that collapsed because he underpriced jobs until he was effectively paying strangers to let him mow their lawns. There was the used car stretch, where he bought cars with secrets in their engines and then talked about integrity while the repair bills added up into an invoice that integrity declined to pay. Threaded between these ventures were multi-level dreams he bought by the case, boxes stacked in a storage unit like a shrine to the god of almost. He always described losses as market misreadings, or other people's failures of imagination. If you listen to that enough, you can forget numbers tell stories as clearly as words do. Janice has been the ballast and the wind. She is an administrative coordinator at a mid-sized insurance company, and $58,000 a year is the tone she hums, steady, predictable, comforting until you realize it's also the soundtrack to a life spent underwriting other people's gambles. She signs paperwork without reading every clause, because she trusts that it'll be fine, and when it isn't, she calls me with the lyric, "Can you just cover this month so we don't fall behind?" She tells people I do some art projects, because to call my work a profession would be to climb a ladder that looks directly into the loft where her husband keeps his weather vanes. She is not unkind. She is, perhaps, devout, in the church where keeping the peace is the holiest sacrament, and the first martyr is always the person who says the truth too clearly. I don't know when exactly the monthly supports became permanent. Mortgage first, because threats of foreclosure shout in capital letters and arrive in envelopes no one wants to open. I set up an automatic transfer, $2,400 on the 5th, because automation is how professionals trap chaos. Then the car insurance, $320, because a lapse is illegal and liability is a debt that hunts. Internet and cable, $215, because hope requires connectivity when you're chasing the next miracle. Streaming, about $85, because if you're at home more than you're at work, you need narratives to live inside. The family phone plan, $160, because the word family in a plan name is a sedative. Then the credit card, a balance that I started knocking down just this once until once had a rhythm. These were not decisions I made in one day. They were decisions made on Tuesdays and Thursdays and the second Sunday of the month, disguised as errands or kindnesses, until the whole thing, viewed from above, looked like a subsidy, with my name typed neatly under payer. There is a script in families like mine that doesn't need to be spoken aloud to be obeyed. It says that real work is heavy, visible, and external, backbreaking, hand-staining, uniformed. It says that something done at a desk with a stylus spoiled by air conditioning is pretend. It says that daughters repay childhood by funding the overtime of their father's second adolescence. It says that respect means silence, and silence means love. I grew up memorizing that script. I also grew up discovering that scripts can be revised. The first time I handed my mother the Eisner and watched her smile like we were discussing a casserole that turned out surprisingly okay, I understood what my success would be used to obscure. "That's nice, dear," she said, and pivoted, her voice light, her eyes bright. "So your father has this new idea. What my father has always been allergic to isn't labor. He works very hard at the front end of things. He's allergic to feedback loops. Market research to him is a mood board of desire." When he presented the coffee kiosk franchise, $139,000, to buy into a brand that would take royalties off the top while he took pride in place, he had foot traffic charts that looked like they had been drawn with a ruler. He had profit margins that assumed inventory behaves, and people buy pastries with their coffee, and employees materialize already trained. He said passive income the way people say paradise. He begged the question with this refrain: $139,000 is nothing to you. It's hard to explain how it feels to hear the hours of your life converted into a throwaway line. The work that let me choose my rent, fund my health insurance, pay my taxes, and sleep turned into nothing. He wasn't asking me to invest. He was asking me to confess that my labor was a windfall, that I had been lucky, that it was time at last to tithe. The party by the pool was the culmination of a pressure campaign practiced many times in private. He made it public because witnesses can be weaponized. If I said no in front of 15 relatives, he could paint me with new colors: selfish, unfilial, hoarding while others struggle. This is a rhetorical move older than any of us. It relies on the oldest arithmetic in the book. One daughter against a room of family will always be outvoted, and if you refuse the vote, you become the problem. But when he lifted my laptop and let go, he did me a brutal favor. He made the invisible visible. He performed the contempt that had always lived behind phrases like real job and help us out this once." He taught the room a lesson about intention dressed as clumsiness. And the room taught me a lesson about silence dressed as civility. People sometimes ask me why I didn't fight harder then and there, why I didn't roll up my dress and dive after the machine, why I didn't demand that someone retrieve their integrity from the deep end. The answer is unglamorous, effect size. Even if I'd saved the device, the story would not have changed. The point was never the hardware, it was the hierarchy. My father needed to demonstrate that the thing I built could be destroyed by a shrug. My mother needed to demonstrate that she could reframe the scene before anyone's appetite was spoiled. My relatives needed to demonstrate that their comfort mattered more than my pages. I had been documenting their demonstrations for years without giving it that name. By the time the laptop sank, I had an archive. It's fashionable to talk about boundaries, less fashionable to build them where everyone can see the fence line. But this is the documentary portion of our feature. We must show, not tell. My father's failures are not sins. They are statistics. The restaurant, the landscaping, the used cars, the MLMs, the pressure washer, the franchise pitch, their common denominator is a refusal to reconcile dream with data. My mother's enabling is not villainy, it is devotion misdirected, loyalty paid out in someone else's currency. My contribution was not charity, it was an unbilled service plan. None of that will change with another speech. Change arrives with a ledger and a switch. After the pool, as I sat among my files and the midnight hum of a city that never learned my name, I realized I was done underwriting the family's thesis that my work wasn't work, even as it kept the bank from saying so. I could love them and stop financing the lie. I could forgive them and still revoke access. I could be their daughter and not their credit line. The clarity didn't make me cruel. It made me accurate. Inside accuracy, there is a strange, stubborn mercy. You finally let people learn the lesson your cushioning prevented. And maybe that's love in its adult form, not the cushion, but the consequence. There is an old joke in publishing that a book is built from two currencies, hours and invisibility. The same can be said of how I'd been keeping my parents' house upright. What looked, from the outside, like a stable middle-class life, mortgage current, cars insured, Wi-Fi humming, TV always logged in, phones always on, was not the fruit of guaranteed success. It was a scaffold I'd assembled one quiet payment at a time. If I had to testify under oath, I could give you the ledger without checking a single statement. Numbers that precise carve themselves into memory. The mortgage first, $2,400 on the 5th of every month. 18 months straight. The transfer was set to hit their account 3 business days before the lender pulled. A cushion built to absorb a weekend or a bank holiday. I named the automation Home Peace because names shape feelings, and I was buying peace every month. It worked until peace transformed into presumption. Then the car insurance, $320, paid on the 28th because coverage lapses are not merely inconvenient, they are illegal. I had been there for the call when a friend of theirs was rear-ended and learned what uninsured means at a tow yard. I removed that risk from our family equation without fanfare. Internet cable, $215. Friends of my father like to say you can't build a business without connectivity, and my mother cannot decompress without the home screen greeting her with infinite rectangles of escape. Streaming platforms were the cushions on the couch. Netflix, Max, Disney Plus, Prime, Apple, Paramount. They stacked into roughly $85 a month, small numbers individually, together a subscription to an anesthetic. Then the family phone plan, $160, which reads sentimental but bills as infrastructure. Modern life collapses quickly when calls go to emergency only. And finally, the card. The one they didn't know I was paying down because the shame of compounding interest is a corrosive thing. I told myself I was stopping a leak. I did stop a leak. I also taught them to keep drilling. None of these payments were gestures. They were systems. If you looked at my accounts, you'd see tidy recurring entries and the occasional manual intervention when a due date moved or a billing cycle hiccuped. That tidiness masked the truth. I had become their lender, their insurer of last resort, their silent partner in a life they narrated as self-reliant. I did not require thank yous. But the absence of gratitude is different from the presence of contempt, and contempt is what the pool revealed. The oops was a knife, and accident was the cloth they used to wipe it clean. I keep coming back into the way witnesses change a scene. Kenneth did not need a crowd to be cruel. He needed a crowd to be right. When he said $139,000 is nothing to you, he wasn't making a budgetary argument. He was drafting a chorus. He knows the choruses families can become. Family is the word people use when they need the strongest leverage for the lowest facts. He wanted to fix me in place as the hoarder of luck who refused to share. The device sinking into the deep end was the exclamation point. The room performed the agreement by performing nothing at all. Later, at my desk, each line of my concealed ledger flickered through my mind with annoying clarity, the way a familiar UI haunts your peripheral vision after too many hours of work. Home piece, auto, cable, stream stack, family plan, balance. In a graphic novel, I would draw them as narrow pipes feeding a house seen in cutaway, labels in tidy fonts. I would draw an oxygen meter attached to the foundation and a hand reaching from off panel to turn the valve up whenever the needle trembled. This is the documentary portion of our feature. The oxygen wasn't free. It never is. It's tempting to tell this next part as pure fury. It would be clean to say I slammed a fist and swore I'd scorch the earth. But that's not what happened. I made tea. I put on the soft sweater I wear when deadlines get close and the city decides to be loud. I reread the note taped to the bottom corner of my monitor. Protect the work. Protect your future self. Those two sentences have saved me from so many false bargains. They saved me again. Because what I needed to protect now was not just a book. It was the person who had allowed her love to be repackaged as an ATM. My editor's deadline sat 2 months away like a red buoy. At any other time, that marker would have governed everything. I would have reorganized groceries around it. But I understood something else in the quiet after midnight. The book and the boundary were the same project. Finishing the meridian cycle would require the stability My family had relied on me to generate and then squander. If I wanted to bring Volume 2 in clean, I could not afford the next crisis call, the next just this month, the next we'd do it for you. They would always be there. The work would not survive if I kept answering at speed. That night, I reviewed the franchise pitch with a colder lens than I'd offered at the party. The coffee kiosk royalties, the ad fees, the inventory spoilage assumptions, the staffing fantasies, the legal obligations to a brand that would never bleed with us if numbers took a turn. Even the optimistic foot traffic heat maps, graded reds and oranges, so pretty you forget you're looking at guesses. I've spent enough time drawing maps to know the difference between a legend and a legend. Hidden beneath the spreadsheet gloss was the same old requirement. My hours turned into his safety net. You could call it investment. You could also call it erasure. The difference between an accident and a consequence is authorship. I kept repeating that to myself like a line of dialogue I wanted to get right on the page. An accident is what you call it when you refuse to name the author. A consequence is what happens when the author finally signs their work. I have spent my adult life signing my work with care. It was time to sign this part of my life with equal care. Not a tantrum. Not a disappearing act. A revision. So I opened the folder where I keep boring miracles, logins, multi-factor backups, PDF'd statements, those tiny screenshots I take when a phone agent says you're all set, and I don't yet trust a sentence so casual. I clicked through each service I funded and read the terms again. There is a strange peace in discovering that a life you built can also be unbuilt with the same deliberation. My cursor hovered over one recurring transfer, the mortgage, and I didn't click. Not yet. This isn't a revenge story that confuses impulsiveness with power. I wanted accuracy. If the scheduled pull hit in 5 days, I had 5 days to plan the order of operations, so the lesson would be clear without needlessly cruel choreography. Meanwhile, I walked the house in my head. What would go first? What would reveal the structure without collapsing the roof? I imagined the timeline the way I imagine a chapter. The power flickers before the storm, then the rain lashes, then the water recedes, and the street shines under an honest sun. Connectivity would be the first flicker, streaming the first lash, phones the sudden, practical rain, the mortgage the river leaving its banks. And in all of it, a single note, written with the precision of an artist who loves a callback. Oops. Looks like I accidentally canceled some things. Just a small mistake. These things happen. You should plan better. Even as I drafted the note in my head, I thought about the people who would interpret it. My mother would call it cruelty, because she conflates discomfort with harm. My father would call it overreaction, because he calls boundaries betrayal when they interfere with his optimism. 1 or 2 relatives would text me the thermometers of their concern. Are you okay? You know your parents love you, right? A cousin would say what I needed someone to say. He did it on purpose. We all saw it. I'm sorry I didn't speak. These are the risk assessments you learn to make when you've spent years annotating conversations in your head so you won't misremember who said what. It might help to say out loud, "Here, The thing I whispered to myself as the plan sharpened. I am not leaving them to drown. I am leaving them to swim. For years, I held them above water with an arm that was supposed to be drawing. If consequence is a form of education, then the syllabus must start with buoyancy. Let them feel weight, find rhythm, kick. Let them discover that the words family helps family do not mean Maya erases Maya. If they want internet, there is a provider. If they want streaming, there are passwords and plans. If they want phones, there are carriers and bills. If they want a house, there is a lender who takes money in exchange for shelter. If they want a business, there are investors who read pro formas without smiling. Around 1:30, the city had gone fully to sleep. I took one more slow walk through the files. Volume 1, locked. Volume 2, on schedule. Character Bibles aligned like soldiers in a parade. The world was intact, which meant my world could risk being honest. I placed the sticky note higher on the monitor where I couldn't miss it in the morning. Protect the work. Protect your future self. The next scene wouldn't begin until midnight tomorrow, when I would have the patience for precision and the calm for signatures. I closed my eyes and saw the ring on the pool water again, not as a bruise this time, but as a timeline. Ripples widen because something disturbs the surface. Consequences widen because someone finally does. Midnight changed the temperature of the room. It always does. The city outside my window kept its promises. A far siren, a truck gearing down, the soft hiss of tires on late pavement. Inside, the only sound was the small, decisive music of keys. Calm is anger with a metronome, and mine was set to quarter notes. I opened the folder labeled Boring Miracles and began. 1203 okay. The mortgage transfer. The automation was named Home Peace, and the name had become untrue. Scheduled to move in 5 days. It had been cushioning Kenneth and Janice from a reality that would have taught them sooner and more gently than I was about to. I removed the scheduled transfer with the same steady breath I use when inking a long contour line. A dialog box asked, "Are you sure?" I was. I took a screenshot and dragged it into the new folder I'd made the night before, Accident Archive. If anyone ever asked me to testify to myself most of all, I wanted the record to be primary source, not memory. 1227 ago. Auto insurance. I dialed the 24-hour line, pressed the correct numbers, and waited for a human. I need to be removed as a paying party on these policies, I said, and I had every detail at hand because I had been the hand holding those details together. The representative was brisk in the way people are when their lives depend on tidy protocols. "We can process that immediately," she said. I asked for a confirmation email, a reference number, and the timestamp. When she read it to me, I wrote it down as if it were a line of dialogue I didn't want to get wrong. In Accident Archive, I created a subfolder, 1227, Auto, 111A, M. Streaming, Netflix, Max, Disney Plus, Prime, Apple, Paramount. You could stack their logos like coasters, and they would look like the kind of life my parents thought they'd earned. I canceled them one by one, each site performing heartbreak in its own UX. Are you sure? Here's what you'll miss. I was sure. They would miss a show. I had missed respect. Confirmation emails arrived in a slow, steady rain. I saved them all. The folder felt heavy, and I knew that was an illusion. Weight is not how files work. But it felt like the right word for what I was carrying out of that house. 1M44. Internet and cable. I called the provider and threaded my way through the voice menu with the particular patience you develop when you've lettered hundreds of pages of dialogue bubbles and learned where lines can bend and where they must break. "I'm the account holder," I said when I reached an agent. "Terminate service at this address." We settled on a 72-hour disconnect, a window wide enough to be noticed and narrow enough to prevent a dash to their phones for a rescue text. "You can always reinstate," the agent said cheerfully, "because the world assumes that money dances back when you snap your fingers." I asked for a service order number, noted the date, and hung up. 203 M. The family plan. This one felt like removing stitches. The carrier was eager to help because companies love separations that create new accounts. "We'll split their lines to their own billing profile," the rep said, as if announcing a graduation. "There will be an immediate prorated charge to start the cycle." I knew. I had done the math. About $400 due at once to keep their phones talking. I thought about the phrase we use without thinking, emergency calls only, and understood, finally, that an emergency is exactly what the family had been calling me every time they wanted to avoid a bill. I took the confirmation, saved the PDF, and moved on. 219 Mem. The mortgage company. Not to pay. To clarify. I wasn't a co-borrower, never had been, and they needed to annotate their notes accordingly. I left a paper trail, an email sent to the correspondence address with the subject line Account Responsibility, Clarification. In it, I was precise. "I am not responsible for this loan. Please remove my contact information from all non-emergency communications. Do not contact me for payments or arrangements. Documentary stories depend on clean narration." I wrote like I was building a voiceover into a cut. 241. Mni. The card. This one I left alone. I had been paying it quietly to keep their financial blood pressure from exploding in public places. That had been my rationale, and it had worked. It had also taught them the body could endure any diet of denial. I checked the balance, closed the tab, and let the math revert to truth. You do not rehab an addiction by refilling the bottle with different labels. 253 M. The block list. I stared at my phone as if it were a character waiting for direction. Kenneth's name. Janice's. The family group thread that contained recipes and baby photos and the constant subtext of needs. Block, block, mute. The quiet that followed was not empty. It was a new room, one I would have to furnish with better habits, answer after thinking, say no as a complete sentence, refuse to litigate decisions that call themselves love while billing has control. 307 M. The note. I printed it because I wanted paper, weight, ink, stamp. I wanted the older ritual that feels like consequence, even if it's only an envelope crossing a city. Oops. Looks like I accidentally canceled some things. Just a small mistake. These things happen. You should plan better. I placed it in an envelope addressed in my neatest hand, because art and spite should never share fonts. In the bottom right corner, where a child might place a flourish, I wrote the date. People underestimate the way a timestamp can focus a mind. 3:19 a wee mira. The archive. I reviewed the folder like a prosecutor on the morning of trial. Confirmation emails neatly named. Screenshots titled with service, date, time. Auto removed. Streaming cancelled. Internet cable terminate in 72 hours. Family plan split. Immediate billing. Mortgage transfer deleted. Mortgage company clarified. The architecture of a life unbuilt is disturbingly clean. It felt like pacing off a scene with a tape measure, precise angles, tidy cuts, light where there had been shadow. I thought of the pool and its round bruise expanding. Then I thought of something else, how long ripples take to reach a wall. By morning, consequences began their ordinary work. Notifications pinged my parents' accounts, declines, warnings. We need new payment information. I did not see them, but I know the rhythm because I've watched dashboards long enough to hear their phantom alerts. That afternoon, the house would discover that streaming had died. That evening, the first call to customer service would end with a demand for a card. The next day, the phones would show a billing screen where the dial pad used to be. On the 5th day, the mortgage draft would fail, and an email would arrive that did not breathe. Insufficient funds. 5 business days to remit before late fees. Further failures will initiate default procedures. There would be anger before there was fear. There would be indignation before there was honesty. People often need to run every stage of grief before they admit the death is of their favorite alibi. I mailed the note on my way to the studio. The clerk did not comment on my envelope. To him, it was Tuesday. I loved the banality of that. I loved that life could be both an act of war in one house and a shrug in another. Back at my desk, I opened volume 2, and the page greeted me like a room that had been cleaned while I slept. I drew. I wrote. I inked. I lettered. I did the work that makes money and meaning at the same time, and I felt the slight vertigo of a woman who has just cut a weight she has carried so long. She had forgotten it was not part of her spine. 2 days later, my phone, quiet except for work, flashed a number I didn't recognize and then went still. That is how it would be from now on. Their reach abridged to whatever ingenuity they could muster without me. In the quiet, I remembered a line from a character I drafted years ago and never used. Mercy without boundary is merely a subsidy. I placed it in the margin of my current script, and for the first time, it fit. Perhaps that is what vindication looks like when it's not performing, not triumph, not public shaming, not choreographed hurt, but the restoration of proportion. I had tried kindness as a standing order. Now I would try truth as a system. By week's end, I would learn, through cousins who still said my name like it was made of glass, how the house reacted. But that is a later scene. This scene ends with me closing Accident Archive, saving my work, and shutting off the lamp. Outside, a truck reversed with its high, bright beeping, and somewhere, a neighbor laughed too loudly at something on a screen I had not paid for. I brushed my hand against the sticky note on my monitor. Protect the work. Protect your future self. You don't always get to choose what people throw into your life. You do get to choose whether you keep refilling their pool. Sada. 48 hours after midnight, the house began to sound different, even from far away. I didn't hear it directly, I heard it in the gaps. In the afternoon that used to be filled with the hum of a TV menu, there was sudden quiet. At 3:12 p.m., the internet cable provider executed the termination order. A technician somewhere flipped a switch, or a string of software flags updated in a database, and the living room went blunt. My parents called the number on the bill. A polite voice informed them that the account holder had ended service. "You can open a new account," the voice said, as if offering a drink of water. "We'll just need a deposit, the first month, and we'll run a credit check." That's roughly $500 for the privilege of recreating what had been invisible while I paid for it. In my head, I drew the scene in cross-section. A couch, two silhouettes, notification banners like speech bubbles that never detach from the screen. That evening, the streaming platforms began their quieter refusals. Netflix showed a page that asked for a card. Max, Disney Plus, Prime, Apple, Paramount queued their variations of loss prevention copy. Don't miss your favorites. People who speak that language for a living know it's designed to convert dread into purchase. My parents had always treated those icons as utilities, not luxuries. Utilities don't stop unless someone fails. They were going to have to decide now what failure they wanted to acknowledge. On the second day, the phones blinked an abrupt syllabus. When the family plan split, the billing began like a starting pistol, about $400. Due now if you want to keep speaking. Call histories turned to billing prompts. Every carrier shop window in the city became a mirror that asked a simple question: whose money is this month? Somewhere around then, Kenneth tried my number. It rolled to the unfriendlier version of nowhere. Janice tried too. The calls slid past the walls of my day like shadows, visible if I looked for them, otherwise the kind the city swallows whole. I kept working. A page that had been obstinate the day before gave in. I inked its backbone, lettered breathing room into its panels, and felt the discipline of consequence begin to loosen the knot just below my sternum. On the 5th day, the mortgage draft failed. This is not a loud sound. It does not shatter anything. It's a letter with no breath and square paragraphs. Insufficient funds. Please remit within 5 business days to avoid fees. Continued failure may result in foreclosure proceedings. The grammar of a lender's patience is strict and impersonal. It does not care who is kind. It cares who pays. A cousin, one of the few who sends me truth, even when it embarrasses her, texted from a new number. They're freaking out. The bank called. They didn't know you'd canceled. I put the phone face down on my desk and traced a line over and over in the margin of a layout until it smoothed into the exact curve I wanted. It is astonishing how many kinds of steadiness can be learned in one life. By the morning of the 6th day, my phone's blocked messages widget, which I rarely glance at, showed the silent count of attempts: 37 calls from Kenneth's number, 42 from Janice's, 63 texts truncated into previews that gave away their arc. Confusion, anger, bargaining, fear. One came through from an unrecognized line and sat on my voicemail like a small, wheezing animal. It was Janice. "Maya, honey, we need to talk about this misunderstanding. Your father's accident with the laptop was unfortunate, but you're overreacting. We could lose our house because of your anger. Please call us back so we can resolve this before things get worse." Her voice has always been efficient at extracting consent. It did not find purchase this time. I replied with one text to the new number. "Not an accident. You destroyed 2 years of my work on purpose and then called it accidental. I have ended the support that hid that truth. Learn the difference between accidents and consequences." Then I blocked that line too. There's a common critique of boundaries, that they are cruel. But the leniency that had kept the house standing wasn't kindness. It was a subsidy with lace edges. 2 weeks in, the consequences sorted themselves with the tidy cruelty of systems returning to their defaults. Car insurance canceled for non-payment. Driving became an act dressed in risk. A credit card, one I had been paying quietly, went late, then froze, and the word they felt was suddenly. The mortgage payment missed twice. The default notice arrived with its formality sharpened. There are phrases that strip a house down to its frame. Notice of default is one of them. Kenneth tried again to call. When that failed, my mother orchestrated a family intervention the way she once orchestrated my piano recitals. Invite list, light refreshments, a script that allowed for applause. I did not attend. I will not be lectured by people who watched my work be destroyed and called it an accident. I texted the cousin hosting. "I wish you a peaceful evening." The report I got later divided the room more cleanly than she expected. Some relatives nodded along to the victim narrative. Maya is cruel, Maya is dramatic, Maya is ungrateful. But others, who had seen the water bloom and heard the word oops, said this out loud. It didn't look like an accident. They said it politely. They said it once. And then they stopped because families don't like the sound of truth scraping their plates. But I marked it down anyway, on a mental card that I file under, possible futures. 1 month after midnight, behavior began to change the way cliffs begin to change, slowly at first, then all at once. They borrowed from Janice's sister to stop the immediate bleed at the bank. There is always a relative who functions as a second-line lender until their own house angles toward risk. They sold 1 car. They downgraded entertainment from everything, always to basic, and discovered that a house is quieter when you cannot drown it in sound. They stopped dining out, at least in the way that involves checks. My mother took more hours, which is a phrase that means more time traded for a smaller wage than anyone likes to say out loud. Kenneth, finally, stopped spending his afternoons with real estate listings and started bringing home job applications. He told people he knew he was consulting now, because men like my father will rename labor until it doesn't hurt. The extended family's collective understanding also shifted. The brother who has always liked numbers more than stories asked a simple question at a barbecue and did not whisper, So Maya was paying your mortgage while you were saying her work wasn't real. The quiet that followed was not reverence, it was recalculation. Reputations turn slowly in families. Then, suddenly, they don't. And me? I worked. Volume 1 of the Meridian Cycle landed early because I had cut the noise that kept me forever on the edge of almost. Reviewers who received advance copies sent back phrases I keep folded in my wallet like a superstition, luminous, rigorously imagined, morally precise. The starred reviews that visited Shadowlands Rising came again. An Eisner nomination followed, and for the first time I let myself practice what I might say. If called to a microphone I didn't think I would ever stand behind. Pre-orders rose 40% over my last launch. My editor, not maternal, but learned in care, wrote me a note. Whatever you did, keep doing it. Vindication is not the right word for what I felt. Vindication needs an audience. What I felt was proportion restoring itself, as if the book and I had finally agreed on how much we owed each other. 6 months after the pool, the house my parents lived in was smaller in some ways and more honest in others. They had not drowned. They had learned to swim in water they had mistaken for air. The words they used changed, if only because certain words stopped working on me. Family, for instance, stopped meaning you will pay for my errors, and started meaning you will not lie about what I've done. I don't know what stories they told themselves at night. I do know that my own story shed an entire subplot, in which the protagonist plays Atlas, while the chorus calls her selfish for having shoulders that ache. It would be easy to end this chapter with a high note, a montage, a victory lap through New York streets at golden hour. That is not a documentary ending. The truth is more functional than that. I turned in Volume 2 to on schedule. I slept through a Saturday for the first time in months, without dreaming about due dates that wore my parents' faces. I stood by the window one morning and watched a neighbor add soil to a window box, tamping it down with the heel of a hand, and thought, that's all a life is, really, what you decide to grow and what you stop watering. My parents had stopped calling me an accident and learned to live with consequences. I had stopped being their consequence and returned to being my own author. When the default notice turned into a structured arrangement rather than an auction date, a cousin texted me a sun emoji. I sent back a book emoji. There are 100 ways to say, we all survived. This was mine. 2 years is enough time for some truths to ripen and others to rot. 2 years after the pool, after oops and accident, and the quiet midnight with its small, decisive music, my life did not look like a revenge fantasy. It looked like a ledger finally balanced. The Meridian Cycle wasn't just finished, it was fully itself. Volume Y had arrived early, Volume 2 on schedule, Volume 3 on the day I promised in a voice to my editor that did not shake. The trilogy stepped into the world with the weight of something that had been paid for, by hours, by boundaries, by the decision to stop confusing subsidy with love. The results wore ordinary names that meant everything to a working artist. Bestseller. Critical acclaim that didn't just offer adjectives, but analysis. Formally ambitious, one review said. morally precise, and emotionally literate. Another called it world building without the colonial hangover, and I kept that sentence like a charm against shortcuts. Translations expanded beyond 12 languages, the character names slipping gracefully into scripts I could not read but trusted for their music. A major streaming service bought the television adaptation rights, and the contract did not feel like a ransom or a mirage. It felt like a door that opened because I had built the floor beneath it. Money arrived in the way good money arrives, predictable, taxed, planned for. I hired a lawyer I liked and a financial planner who didn't condescend. Awards didn't deliver salvation. They delivered schedule conflicts and dress fittings, and proof that working with care doesn't go unnoticed forever. An Eisner nomination returned with a companion category I had never dared to imagine, and I wrote a speech that would make good use of exactly 1 minute without apologizing for anything. My reputation, which had once felt fragile enough to be smudged by a smirk, grew into something sturdier, an artist whose pages read like architecture, whose stories kept their promises, whose boundaries were not a personality quirk, but a production principle. I learned how to say no without inflating it into a performance of power. I learned how to say yes without tying it to a debt. I learned that support and sponsorship are not synonyms, that gift is not a leash, that family is not a coupon code you can redeem at the bank. People ask me about my parents as if they are a twist ending. There isn't one. They learned to live in the house they could afford. Kenneth stopped introducing himself as a future franchise owner and started showing up where a paycheck could be earned now. He doesn't call that resignation. He calls it consulting on logistics, and I let the phrase live where it causes the least harm. Janice increased her pay by moving to a larger firm, where her steadiness counts in ways fancier titles often fail to notice. Their car carries legal insurance again. Their internet works because they decided it mattered enough to pay for. The TV logs in only because someone typed a card's digits with a steady hand. The mortgage sits on an arrangement that requires them to treat due dates like all adults must, as facts, not opinions. I don't fund them. I don't shout about it either. The intervention a cousin once tried to orchestrate has aged into a cautionary anecdote we don't tell at gatherings because people prefer to laugh, and that story doesn't have jokes. When I visit for holidays, short visits, with departure times that respect everyone's stamina, we speak like people who remember each other's childhoods and have learned the limits of their power to change a past. Sometimes we eat in the living room because the table has become a desk for Janice's extra hours, and I take that as a tidy metaphor handed to me without effort. Work where you can, make room where you must. Does reconciliation require apologies? In a courtroom, perhaps. In a life, something more practical often suffices. My father has never said, "I'm sorry," without padding. But he has said, "How are your pages?" And waited for the answer. He has said, "That TV deal, that's something." And he didn't say it like a complaint pretending to be praise. My mother will still instinctively smooth a scene that would teach more if left rough, but she has learned to leave some silences unfilled. She does not call my work projects anymore. She calls them your books, and while I will never need her to love them, I accept what it costs her to use the right word. If there's philosophy to be smuggled into a story like this, it isn't complicated. Kindness without boundaries breeds cruelty. Boundaries without malice breed growth. Accidents are what we call choices when we want to disinfect them. Consequences are what we call choices when we sign our names to them. In families, language can be a laundering machine, disrespect washed as tradition, extraction perfumed as obligation. The documentary truth is less floral. Houses stand because money moves on time. Lives stand because respect moves on time. 2. I get letters now that tell me my books did more than entertain. A nurse wrote that she reads the meridian cycle on a bus between shifts because the panel gutters give her brain room to breathe. A teacher wrote that a student who hadn't spoken all semester found words to describe a character's mistake and then found words to describe his own. A grown man in his 50s wrote that he left a job where the word family was used like a cattle prod, and he thanked me for a line I had nearly cut because I thought it was too on the nose. What you tolerate teaches. He said he printed it and taped it to his monitor. He said on hard days he points to it and breathes. Vindication fiction promises neat arcs. Real life gives you maintenance. I maintain my boundaries. I maintain my friendships like gardens and my finances like a house that doesn't want to surprise me. I maintain my craft like a musician scales, daily, not dramatically. What I no longer maintain is a fantasy where love means underwriting someone else's refusal to learn. That fantasy sank the night a laptop did, and the truth that bobbed to the surface wasn't bitter. It was buoyancy. I float when I stop holding my breath for people who won't swim. If you have stayed with me this long, thank you for the attention. For the willingness to sit through the parts where the good guys don't get applause, and the necessary choices don't make good television. I don't want your sympathy. I want you to have your boundaries and your work and your oxygen. If someone in your life destroys your labor and calls it an accident while living on the income that labor brings, you are not obligated to keep pumping air into a room where you can't breathe. Open a window. Or better, open a door. To those who wrote me after Shadowlands Rising and said the book made a table feel less empty, this trilogy is for you most of all. I didn't quit on my characters when the water closed over, and I didn't quit on the person who makes them. If any part of this story steadied your hands, I am grateful in the plainest, least performative way. Thank you for reading. Thank you for making the kind of life in which stories can be anything more than escape. I wish you good health and a home where the words you hear most often are the ones that make you larger, not smaller. I wish your family, by blood or by choice, peace that doesn't require you to shrink to fit inside it. And if this story helped you hold a line you needed to hold, I hope you'll subscribe so we can keep telling the kinds of stories that don't flinch when the water ripples. We'll meet again in the next one. Until then, take care of your work, and it will take care of you.